Hi, my name is Benedict. Today's video is about the kHs Dynamics processor. Now, you know I'm often borderline derogatory about compressors. I'll explain that first. Largely, I find that there's just far too much chatter about them. They seem to be the first thing that people reach for to solve a problem that they don't really understand, but they think, oh, it must be compression. Yeah, it probably isn't. You can do a great mix without a compressor, without a single one. So it's not the first thing that you should be reaching for. Now, I won't say they don't have a use, because what I'm going to show you is covered in compressor, and it's covered in the same compressor, often doing the same things over and over again, so that there are some advantages and things to be gained from doing that. But a lot of compressors are really more of the same. They're a lot about marketing, or as Mr. Whitesea says, snake oil. A lot of that. But sometimes somebody gets something about their compressor setup that makes it actually very cool to use. Does what this device do is massively different from what any other device does? No. But that's great. There is no snake oil, there's no massaging or altering or anything like that. It simply mathematically does what it says it's going to do. And as a result of doing that and the way that it's laid out, it actually makes it a joy to use. Not only as a compressor, just a simple direct compressor, but also for its second function, which is the other side, the opposite side. So that's what it looks like. This bit on that side, or that side of the screen over here, you'll recognize, because, well, gee, that looks like a compressor. But then we got this funny bit over here, that's the expander bit. And I'll let you hear what that does, because it can be very powerful. So let's just start with, here's a piece that's covered in kHs Dynamics everywhere. Okay, so clearly got a real retro wave kind of feel to it, and that's something that I liked about this device, that it was actually really cool for that. It was really cool for pushing things forward. Not a thing I normally do. I normally look to have more subtlety, but seeing I was playing with this, and that's what I came out with, it was like, you know, this is doing a really nice job of this. I can be a bit heavy-handed with this, and it delivers very nicely. And here's part of the reason why. The second half. So actually, no, before I go into what I'm going to do, because I'm going to show you the usual kind of attacking drums of it, let's now dip through this mix with all of the Dynamics processors off. So it's happening on every single instrument, and you'll see that it makes a difference in each case. Just so you can see, there's just a tiny bit of EQ, a dB off in the mids, a dB up in the highs, just pushing the levels so that they're coming right into the final tube limiter. Simple stuff. Now its role, particularly with the strings, is quite subtle. Without the compressor, they can tend to be they can take over a little bit. Not a lot, but there's that tendency for them to take over a little bit, whereas I want them to be told, no, you stay under. You go down there and you stay there. And that's what the compressor is doing in this case. The other sounds are brass. Now that's where you get that really retro wave kind of push it right forward sort of feel. And that's where this has behaved beautifully for doing that without imparting any kind of change on my tone. Obviously the tone changes because of what I'm doing to it. It becomes more big and round and rubbery, but it's not out of anything that you might call destructive. It hasn't changed, it's merely said, here, we'll let you hear more of what's going on here. So it's pretty cool for that push forward thing. So that's got everything except for our bass line back in. So each instrument's fairly subtle. We don't want to overdo it at the instrument level. Very tempting at the instrument level to say, yeah, I'm going to make it sound like Satan's playing drums with Stonehenge. You kind of don't want to do that, because while it'll sound really impressive and you'll feel very godly at that point as you're starting to compose with your sounds, when you come to try and mix them, they won't go together very nicely, which means that you'll probably then start to apply more compression to make everything go together. And next thing you know, you've just dumped an elephant on your mix. Not a great plan. So this master is actually doing quite a bit of work. And notice that is quite deliberate. That massive extension. You'll hear it here. And again at the end, there's this huge sustain that I've pulled in. It's a function of this device, and I deliberately used it as a feature. So let's step aside for a moment and listen to some real drums. So the MT Power Drum Kit 2, it's a freebie and it's a pretty good thing to have in your collection. Don't need to see that anymore. Let's have a look at this fella. Now, oops, I better turn this off. That's really making a mess. Let's try that again. Pretty typical sort of roomy drum kit, lot of ride and what have you happening there, so it's a very washy sound in some ways. Great if that's what you want, but it's pretty washy. It's not exactly what you'll get if you're if you get stems out of or multi-tracks, because I got told off the other day, of real drums in a sort of garage band going into the studio type situation. You'll get very kind of sound, but this gives you some of that. Now this isn't necessarily meant to be kind, but we've been able to get rid of a lot of that wash. Tighten the kit up. So we'll start with just default settings. Let's let everything go back to default. And I'll show you basically how this device works. As I said, the top half you're going to recognize. There's our threshold. There's what happens to it. There's our ratio. So over this threshold, we start to compress. One thing, well, two things that I don't super love about this plugin and would ask for in a version 2 is some kind of more direct feedback. Attack ratios, they're in percent, 100 to 500% of what? Doesn't give a sense of what it is. Not a killer, because you're using your ears, but kind of nice to know. Same with release, 100% of what? But it does seem to err on the side of being pretty fast most of the time. But it sounds natural, which is what matters. For me, bit extreme, but it's doing its job, and it's doing its job quite nicely. So you can get very aggressive. Now let's say we really did want to get super mean. I like this feature. This is different from your typical parallel compression mix. They often don't balance properly, and that's okay. But this has taken a really, let's just take our process, what you're hearing, and 50-50 it. I don't know how they're doing it. I kind of get the impression that what they're really doing is what you see, altering the actual compression maths. I quite like that. It's useful. So we can set up a ridiculous compression. And create a mix of that. So you can do something hard and then soften it back up. Works really nicely a lot of the time. So that's with a crazy long attack. Nothing. I'm not saying that any of these settings are good or right, merely showing you how they change this source material, how they change this kit. But now here's where this wee fella gets quite interesting. We'll go for a cool. But you can change how things happen below another threshold. They can't cross each other because that would probably be a really messy situation, but they can hit each other, so they can actually be the same point. Sustain. So you can get really mental with it and go quite overboard. We could mix some of that back in. Nice and dynamic, airy. Drum loop that's been thrown against the wall probably 12 times. The other thing that you can do with this is this. Again, super mean. How's that? It's distorting because our times are so short. If we put this back to we've totally reformed the way that our metalwork works. Is it good or bad? Doesn't really matter. But we totally reformed it. And that's interesting. And we are being aggressive here, being very unkind to this material. The next thing that we can do is look at the knee. The knee behaves the same way you expect, but because we've got two thresholds, it really softens out across that. So you can see that here. Softens. What's happening? So we're hitting that really hard, but hear how it's adding a lot of punch and a lot of movement. Again, overkill, but if you're playing around with drum loops, which is essentially what this is, we whacked this off, stole this off someone's records, don't steal, then this is quite a cool way of really hoeing into that loop. If we soften it up, now we've got that room feel. It's still got some of the airy, but it's got this big dynamic punch. Those drums feel. It's just some guy. It's like some guy's got lots of hair and twirls his drumsticks and throws them at the girls in the audience. It's added a lot to that, and that's by us changing both ends of our dynamic. Again, none of this is about what's right or what's wrong, but showing you that with this one device you've got a lot of control how you make the dynamics of this performance come across. So it's really very nice in that. We might just zero some stuff there. Actually, it doesn't really matter because I'm not using that anyway. That was where I started when I was playing with the device to see, well, okay, what does it do, and can I do that already with the stuff that I have either in Reason or Rack Extension or something else? And I quickly came to the conclusion that I don't really think there was anything else that would sound like that. I had things that would do both of those functions, and in theory do both of those functions at once. But did they give me the elegance of that, or even the sonic results of that? No. So that was why it was a win. I also bought it for like $15 US, so it was kind of a steal for that as an intro. Sorry if you've missed that now when you watch this, but it may come up again. It's still a pretty cheap device, and for the amount of use you're likely to get from it if you're excited already, I think it's well worth it, and it's rare for me to recommend devices like this. Normally I'm quite quickly able to say, you know what, you could do without it, because you could do this. If we look at our 808, now it's not a real 808, it's built out of Kong, and it is built out of synthesis. I really rather like this fella. It does the job every time. Just turn that reverb off. Back. That's off. Yeah, how everything's tightened up. Whether that's what you want, up to you, but it's tightened up. We can really change the feel there. You'll have more noticeable change of feel with the expander, especially if you are heavy-handed with it, than you will with the compression. That's really changed that device quite a lot. This kind of sounds free. It's very choppy. We're going 50-50. We're getting a little bit of both. Now on its own, it may not sound as good. But once we get in a mix, the drums just have that little bit more punch. Maybe a bit more than a little bit, but they've got extra punch. That's the whole idea of them. Our monotone, our bass. Drag this fella over. Just leave it there. Now, as you can hear, it tumbles over itself quite a lot because we've got delay and what have you happening, and it's a bit messy. We can try getting rid of the delay, but then we lose the roll and feel of that. But what I wanted, even though I've already got quite short times here, what I wanted was more of that high energy Ken Laszlo kind of bassline feel, which this kind of wasn't giving me. It was giving me some of the Juno thing, but it wasn't giving me the right feel. So first thing we did, just really tightened up the end part of it. The delay's still there. You're quite aware of the delay, but it's not flubbing afterwards. And we've also been pretty heavy-handed on the front end of it as well. We're really saying, look, I want to put you in this box, which is the nature of what happened in high energy and very much is done in retro wave. It's pretty hard. We got rid of the delay. You can hear how much it's really taken that sound and said, oh, I'm going to treat you quite differently. Now with the synthesizer, you may not need to do this as aggressively because you might be able to say, oh, look, I can just go change the envelopes. But changing the envelopes there, or changing it after the fact here, especially when it's got delays going in it, you'll get quite a different feel. And doing it this way, especially quite aggressively, I mean, look at an 8-to-1 ratio, it's mean. It compresses that delay into, it embeds that delay into the core sound. The knee smooths off the transition here a little, as I showed you before. And then I've allowed some of the rest of the sound back in with the mix. The lead, it's not going to be as dramatic a change here. Solo him, solo him. It always feels weird working with one screen. I say it probably every time I do this, but it just is. So we've got the delay appearing, sorry, the lead appearing twice in this with different functions. You see, we're not really doing much in terms of compression, but we're doing quite a bit. We've got a 2-to-1 ratio. So the way that it's coming out is it's really increasing the out of the sound, the sustain. That's what it'd naturally be doing. But even as I raise it up there, you can hear how it really is holding it. What you probably noticed there is the delay. You can hear that delay so much more prominently. So it makes the sound seem a lot more full. And of course that sustain, when we get to this point here, as opposed to huge amount. And again, this difference in the way the sustain behaves, bearing in mind that it's squishing in that delay as well, when you do this, is quite different from if we just said, okay, I'll go to my release on my synth and just make it longer. They don't sound the same. So it's really rather cool. It's a way of making that a lot meatier. The second part, same sound, just treated quite differently. So that's all about playing with this sustain feature. It's doing little to nothing in terms of compression. It's just bringing that whole sound right up. So you get to feel and hear the delays so much more, and the sound commands a lot more, which is a big thing in retrowave. Everything has to be like, I find it tends to be overmixed, but when it's done right, there's kind of a charm, and this has some of that built into it. So it serves that purpose rather well there. Brass. I loves brass. Brass is a reason for living. Now the sound is nice. I love my synth brass. It's nice. It's brassy, it's rubbery, it's synthy, it's got a lot of great things going about it. But in terms of especially the rest of the piece, with everything else being quiet, it doesn't end up having the that you want it to have. Whereas we do this, we give it quite a bit of compression, a 4:1 and a 2:1 on the other side. It's a full mix. Knee softens it off. Quite a bit of attack. So we want the beginning of that sound as it gets into compression to speak. It's got to be allowed to speak. It's got to be allowed to be dynamic still. But we get lots of sustain with that delay and that big, rich, juicy sound. So the moment it starts to come in, it's quite commanding and joyful. If we take this the solo off, there's a lot of excitement in that. If we kill it off, our composition's just as good, but the results aren't. And it's more than just volume. There's a volume boost because we're losing some, but it's more than just volume. It's because we've restructured the way our sound behaves. And by our sound, I mean everything that's in our sound, which is obviously the sound itself with some chorus and unison and what have you. It's a single oscillator as such with a detune from unison and chorusing there, a little bit of drive afterwards for a bit of echo and reverb, which we then push into the Dynamics processor. So it gives us that nice, big, fat, juicy, idealized Juno thing. And then our strings, which really run through the whole thing. They're a bit more interesting to start with. Same situation. Got our choruses and delays happening in here. We've added in another delay and some reverb. It's nice, but it's kind of flat. Even though that delay has no modulation or anything in it, the fact that it's happening sometime later means that there are phase and pitch irregularities between the two of them. And then of course the reverb. Smooshes the whole thing out there. Exactly what happens inside this box, don't know. There's probably some kind of modulation, chorusy type thing going on as well. I like the sound of it. When we push them together with this, our ratios are a fair bit smaller. Still enough to be a bit too aggressive at 100%. We're mostly looking just to make this whole instrument seem bigger. But at the same time, as I said to you earlier, it needs to sort of feel controlled. It's supposed to feel big, but in feeling big, it's not allowed to muffin top over the top. It's, yes, big, it's fat, but it's down below the main instruments, which are your brass and the lead. Hear how there they sort of rise above a little bit. Now, partly what I'm using there is the tendency for compression to minimize high frequency. So I'm actually using it to some extent to roll off some highs. I could have just gone to my EQ and said, yeah, let's roll off some highs. Some super highs, back them off a little bit. Not to use a low pass filter, or you could, but probably just to use a, let's turn them down a little bit so that they seem less dominant, and the highs therefore on our leads will seem more dominant. So it's a function of compression. But because this is doing more than that, everything else in this mix is very controlled because it's all pushing into the compressor and the upward expansion to embiggen it. So if we have a sound that's not that way, it's not going to sit the same. Now that can be a bonus. You can say, hey, I'm going to compress everything in the mix quite aggressively except for the lead saxophone, and then it seems very expansive. Or you can have the problem when you put the lead saxophone in that you go, it just kind of won't sit because everything else has been pushed hard. You need to kind of push it hard to make it match the rest. Depends on what you want your mix to do, what the story of each of those components is. So that's what I did with each of them. When it came to the masters, we'll whack our reverb back on because I didn't actually use any send reverb in this at all. I wasn't planning to write a piece. I was just going. Obviously there's tons of sustain and everything, but then I realized, hang on, it probably should have had a bit of reverb. Rather than messing around with going to work out how much reverb I want to put everything on, I just did the old mastering trick of putting a very small space across the thing. If that's why you're wondering it's there, that's why it's there. That's what it does. Everything's kind of smashed and extended already. And thought, well, okay, let's do the very same thing to the master. So we end up with even more sustain. So where we've got a gap, it's actually musically a gap, but not sonically a gap. Now I know that a lot of people don't like to hear gaps in their music these days. It's like, bring that beat back. Okay, but I don't want the beat at that point. Musically it shouldn't be there. To continue to have that go through, it's tasteless. So it's a pause, but it's a pause that's filled up with everything that came before. On and on and on and on. And then because I've got a fade on the other end, it artifacts. But the whole thing there is that in this case, I decided, well, okay, I'm going to finish it. It'll go up on Pond 5. Someone can put it in a movie. At that point, it's like, let's leave that as long as we can, because if the person's using it as a sort of a dream scene or wants to hang over into the next scene, then they've got the ability to choose what they do with it. They can make a feature of that excessive sustain, or they can simply say, yeah, there's way more than I ever needed there in the first place, and volume ramp it out. No one's going to notice that there's an excessive amount of sustain there. If it was my album, I'd make a decision, but the decision would be based on the story of the piece. Final name of the piece ended up being Neon Ranger, obviously chasing the whole retro wave vibe, so quite happy to have it there. So, giving you quite a few techniques and showing you ways in which we can kind of overdo it and end up with a cool sound as a result of overdoing it, and how you can use a processor like this that's both a compressor and an expander, and particularly how an expander works, because they're kind of the weird one. Compression's weird enough as it is, and expansion's even weirder. But cool device. If you haven't gone down the road of this kind of device and you feel that there might be a use for it, don't get it if you don't feel like there's a use. Absolutely shouldn't do that. It's a waste of money, waste of your time. But if you feel like, yeah, I want to do that, or I'm playing with drum loops and I don't feel like I ever get that smashed sound right, this is the kind of thing you want to do. Get that, you can smash it. Or you can do things like, as you see, you can put effects between and this dynamics processor, and then you're mashing that effect to distortion, whatever you're putting in between, delays in my case mostly here, and you're mashing that into the core sound. And that's a lot of why your classic Public Enemy type drum loops sound like the way they did, because they were just compressing, adding something else, compressing, and mashing all these things into the loop. I hope this has been helpful. If you have any questions, things you'd like me to cover, things you'd like me to help you with, or of course if you want to be in one of my mix walkthrough videos, which I'm sure you can find here with a small amount of effort, then please be in contact, either the box down below or any of the other ways that you can find me online. You have a great day now.